really, really good analysis. Slight issues with categorization, which I'm going to go through on from a few of you. I haven't uploaded marks yet, and I'll get to that. But I thought, yeah, any volunteers, and we'll street view dive to your intersection, and we'll have a look around, and you can talk us through some of the issues you have. Anybody want to put their hand up and say, yep, I'll do that? If not, I'll just dive into one of your intersections anyway, and I'll talk it through. Oh, here we go. Okay, Ash, allowed to talk. So hopefully now you can unmute yourself. Ash, are you there?
Hi there. You right?
Hello, can hear you loud and clear. Now, if were you a Rotorua intersection?
Yeah, that's correct.
Oh, here's one I prepared earlier. Is that your intersection?
Yeah, that's the one.
There you go. I just thought, oh well, if nobody volunteers, I'll just talk through Ash's one, and look at that, it's ready to go. So, right now, beautiful area. Now, tell us a little bit about what. Well, let's go through this in the process of exposure, likelihood, and severity. So, what are some of the things influencing the number of vehicles, number of pedestrians, number of cyclists? So the exposure, yeah.
So the skyline on the side is quite a trip generator. There's a lot of. It also does mountain biking as well as sort of just people going up for sightseeing. So you get quite a lot of mountain bikers in this area. So all the cyclists. That's probably the main trip generator. You also get it's actually it's sort of the main road into Rotorua. Yeah. So a lot of the traffic coming from the north actually has to travel through this road. So actual Rotorua city centre itself is a trip generator for this as well.
That's good. So that's driving the volumes, and our exposure in a safe system assessment really is the volumes. And next module we'll delve into exactly how we sort of account for that in a safe system assessment. But they're good in terms of you've got pedestrians as well, and what's their sort of
yep. So you've got there is the odd as you're looking at it on the right, there's the odd hotel on that side of the road. So you occasionally get people walking from the sort of motels, hotels across into the skyline.
Yep.
But the pedestrian facilities are sort of only one side of the intersection. So if you so you can see it that way, whereas this way you've got there actually isn't a crossing point there. So you're relying on people walking the correct legs of the intersection, so to speak.
Yeah.
So you'd be relying on them crossing. Yeah, if they were coming down that path, you'd be relying on them crossing that side road to then cross that one, and then coming across that one. Just when they could have just walked across where your camera is located.
That's right, or anywhere along there from there.
Yeah, and you often see that. You see pedestrians sort of walking across and stood in the raised median. So.
Yep. I definitely could imagine that. Okay, good. Okay, so we've got that. And cyclists, do you see many cyclists through here?
Like I say, you get a fair few mountain bikers that are going there to actually hit the mountain bike trails up the skyline. So.
Yep. So they ride their bike in.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I'll be honest, because I am a mountain biker, so I can say it. Mountain bikers aren't necessarily the greatest at sticking to road rules and directions. we cut corners where possible and just see the straight line route. Quite used to riding across grass and things, so they can be a bit all over the place sometimes.
Yep. Okay. All right. That's good. So it's giving us an indication of how many users are exposed to crashes. Now, let's talk about the likelihood of crashes. What are some of the factors influencing the likelihood of crashes at this intersection? Good or bad, like improving things or making things worse?
So I think I put the lack of pedestrian crossing facilities increase, just because people are they're not necessarily crossing where they should be, or where cars are expecting them to cross. So that was one thing that could increase. I didn't put it on my thing, but I think just the general, the number of conflict points in the intersection is probably a big one. As well. It is a 60k environment, but if you were to carry on down sort of where you're looking, just around that bend, it goes to an 80. So often people coming at it from that approach are actually traveling slightly faster than 60. So that does. So round that corner, it sort of comes down to 60 just around the corner there. With it being downhill, people are often traveling down here more at 70k than 60k.
Okay, good one. So it's good though there that you've sort of talked about conflict points as a likelihood factor, and that's what we tend to do in a safe system assessment. In the use of the word exposure over sort of in-road safety has been used sort of for quite a variety of things, and the safe system assessment framework, we try to just cordon off exposure to the numbers of vehicles or people, pedestrians or cyclists or motorcyclists, traveling through an intersection. When we get to the number of conflict points, we tend to attribute that to likelihood of crashes, just as you were talking about there. Less conflict points, less likely, less chance of a crash. The same number are exposed to it because they're still sort of going through. Now, it gets a little bit sort of a little bit detailed when you're talking about sort of blocking off a turn movement or something like that, because it might change the traffic volumes or the like, but we can get into a bit of that detail next module. But so they're really good. There's lots and lots of features that we would consider in an intersection like this that alters the exposure, the likelihood. And we've got things like, well, I mean, the presence of traffic signals in their own right is a control that changes the likelihood, reduces the likelihood. You've got mast arms, look like, are they LED or are they all incandescent? They look like LED. You've got lighting, we've got decent road surface, decent line marking. We've got some fully controlled right turn, or it might drop off at part of the day. And those are the kind of things that you can look at. Good mentioning there of speed and the influence speed might have, crossing. You'd also even sort of talk about pedestrian desire lines and those sorts of things influencing the likelihood, as in if they're going from these sorts of areas and they want to get over to here, and that, you'd say crossing facilities not on their desire line. We've got the bit of right turn lane here, median. Then we've got, when we're talking about runoff road crashes in the general vicinity of this intersection, the likelihood of runoff road crashes is the presence of street lighting. So we haven't yet got to whether it's slip-based or not, okay? Because that's a severity factor. Its presence and its offset from edge line, they're the likelihood factors. So we'll go over, have a look at this gantry. So we've got there light, the gantry, and we've got these fence things. They're all sort of factoring into your likelihood of runoff road crashes, because if somebody leaves the road, they've got some space, but then there's things that they could possibly hit. Then you've got your signal, so still on runoff road, you've got your signal pedestals. Then you might look at things like, the phasing, the timing of that sort of stuff. You've got curbing. So you see lots and lots of factors influencing the likelihood of crashes. And that's the one that we tend to see road safety auditors are really good at sort of listing and detailing and factoring in all of this. because that's where there's a huge amount of variables. But let's jump to severity now at this intersection. Ash, what were you thinking when you're thinking about severity of crashes?
Your impact angles are sort of 90 degrees, and with your speed limit being 60, that would be deemed too high.
Yes.
For safe systems.
Yes. Yeah. So that's right. So speeds and angles, they're the big ones for passenger vehicles for sure. And you've done really well there. And yes, it's high. I suppose makes it, not well aligned with safe system principles. So probably going to give you some pretty high scores in a safe system assessment, and high scores are a bad thing in a safe system assessment. We'll get to that again next module. But your speeds and your angles are your big ones there. And then when you're talking about pedestrians and cyclists, it's really down to speed being the big one, maybe sort of presence of heavy vehicles and the like, and percentages of heavy vehicles and things may factor a little bit in, but really it's just going to be speed. And so you're imagining scenarios where they are struck, and how bad is it going to be? Well, it's going to really just depend how fast will they hit by a vehicle. And then when we get into runoff road crashes, for example, we're going to be looking at the frangibility and the friendliness of the roadside. So these are slip-based there, but we know these are not going to be slip-based. They'll be rigid. And then we saw back there that gantry, which was very much
definitely not.
Yeah, that's going to be a nasty. If somebody hits it, that's not going to break away. So they're factoring into the increased severity. So that's a and so you're sort of just analysing different bits like that. Head on, you wouldn't be thinking about can a vehicle get to the other side of the road for the head on, because that's a likelihood factor. And the presence of this median significantly is going to reduce the likelihood of head on, but it doesn't eliminate it. So I'm not going to eliminate that altogether. If somebody, falls asleep or something, they might come through here and they could easily get to the other side here. It's probably a very low likelihood, but then severity is just about the speeds that would be happening. And that one might be closer to your tolerable level. So you might give it a lower score, because that's a 70 kilometre per hour is usually where we're sort of thinking around that. So I might get quite a low score from that perspective. Yep. But well done, Ash. That's excellent. Thank you very much for volunteering there. Actually, before I put you back into the group there, any ideas on how we improve things here?
So from an exposure point, it was probably, I think on my assessment, you could put a bypass to actually bring people in a different, because a lot of it's through traffic. So if there was a bypass, that traffic didn't have to come into this road, unlikely to happen given the terrain around Rotorua. And the volume probably isn't high enough. The other one would be that you could potentially alter the access way into Skyline, which is the main trip generator. You could maybe do that off a different road and close off the intersection. But again, probably quite difficult because this road's sort of built and designed to accommodate that sort of traffic, whereas a smaller local road wouldn't necessarily be designed to take the volume of traffic that's going in and out of that intersection.
Yep. Good. So, okay, and that's they're good, because certainly in the assignment it was just about proving sort of what would alter exposure, and they certainly would alter the numbers, and that was at this intersection. So that's correct. Likelihood.
I think I put raised safety platforms on intersection approaches. Mm-hmm. I was more. I don't think I put it in there, but that was more to for pedestrians as well. So sort of, I should probably put pedestrian crossing facilities within that. But yeah.
Yeah, well, so raised safety platform is an interesting one, and predominantly we tend to, at least for passenger vehicles, attribute it to a severity. It's, but I think likelihood's fair enough in this sort of situation, and certainly if you're thinking about pedestrians and maybe giving them an elevated area to cross as well, and their own facilities and the signals as well, I think it's fair to sort of attribute some reduction in likelihood as well.
And I think for severity, I'd put more like if you put a roundabout style intersection in, so probably not quite big enough in terms of actual roundabout to get the volume of traffic through, but something like a roundabout type of roundabout style intersection to reduce, to change the impact angles would then change the severity.
Absolutely, yeah. So that's right. I mean, if we can alter those angles, we're going to improve it from that perspective. The raised safety platform, as I mentioned, would certainly do a good job there in reducing the severity there. So yeah, good, wonderful options there. I think being that sort of entry into the township, as you say, and the speed limit change, I think something physical is always nice. It almost acts as a bit of a gateway as well in these situations. So whether that is a raised platform on the approach, or maybe even a couple of raised platforms, one maybe across this one, there's a very shallow initial slowdown. So if they are going a little fast, they do something, and then maybe this one a little bit harsher. Then you get a nice gateway into the township. There's lots of options there, and then certainly, looking about, can you reconfigure angles and those sorts of things, which, exactly as you said, Ash, it's going to be a problem for the size of it and the existing infrastructure's there, and it looks like it's quite established for what it is. So major alterations, that would be a challenge. That wasn't part of the exercise to work out whether it was viable or not. And they've done really well in giving us some ideas there. So improvements to all of those different things that we talked about in terms of, if we're talking about the roadside, trying to make things more frangible, reduce the severity, trying to move things away from the edge of road, adding barrier systems. Barrier systems are a really interesting one in a safe system assessment, because if we were to put a barrier system, say, on the edge here, you'd have some challenges with your driveways and sight distances and length of need and those sort of things, but we'll put practical issues aside for the moment. If you were to have a barrier system down there, you probably slightly increase your likelihood of run-off road crashes, but you significantly reduce the severity. But you'll find then in your safe system assessment, you get this contextual balance plays out, where in an environment like this, you might say that, well, the severity wasn't up at 4s for run-off road beforehand, and the likelihood was sort of low because there was some space. So putting a barrier system in shifts that, but it's not giving us as big a benefit as maybe in a higher speed environment with trees and the like, where you had everything up higher. And then so you can look at the different signals, as you say, crossing points, signage, surfaces, these different looking at, is there any confusion in the signage? Are there things to distract or the like? So we get a whole lot of things that we can assess. So that's really really good. Thank you, Ash. Any final things to add there?
I think you explained it quite well.
You did very well. And for volunteering, you're on the prize list for today, Ash. Excellent stuff. Now I'm going to stop sharing that, and I'm going to send you back. Hang on, how do I do this? There we go. All right, thanks, Ash. And Ash is gone. But there you go, wonderful. And just happened to be the intersection that I picked. So I recall safety auditing a roundabout design for this intersection about a decade or so ago, with Steve Muller, who may be on this call too. There you go. I don't know if Steve is on here. But okay, so there was a plan for around about at one point. That's very interesting. And would, yeah, I sort of not making any judgments as to whether that would have been better or worse, a bit of analysis onto that. But what I do sort of note is that, just sort of conventional signalized intersection, and you've got, sort of 60 k's an hour, which maybe even a little bit higher, and energy wise, we do have just inherent risk sitting at this intersection. I mean, it's controlled with signals, so its likelihood's been pulled down, and it's providing that facilities is just, I'm a bit worried about when things go wrong, how severe they're going to be at this location. So, I mean, could be done there. And the thing is that we've just got, thousands and thousands of these out there, don't we? It's signalized intersection in a medium speed environment. And yeah, so I think we can just sort of systematically work through trying to reduce severity at these locations. Good, thank you very much. Well done. Just check any more. Authority wants us to design with less capital costs with greater safety benefits. Yes. Okay, that's a challenge. So one of the things we were talking about there were come with some cost to them. Absolutely, civil infrastructure and other works. We may need to then start to be creative with these sorts of those sorts of facilities. I think we can do the raised platforms at a relatively low cost. Some good ITS, like intelligent transport system, ways to sort of cater and really reduce the likelihood even further. One that an interesting one, and some of you probably have done similar things or looked into similar things. I'll jump back into this one. Is just done quite a while back in Victoria, actually, and then the Queenslanders have just recently picked it up again. We got some history. So what you do is you put a radar on here, and you could do it also with loops and things, looking up the road here, up this direction, and when your signals go orange, the radars are just checking if there's any vehicle at a certain point at a certain speed that they categorize as a rogue vehicle, as in it is going to run the red. And you can work that out. You can go anything in this this zone at these speeds is likely to go rogue and run that red. And then you just simply program your signals to hold the side signals on red also until that rogue vehicle has run through the red, as opposed to giving them the green to come out, and then we're in a conflict. Another thing that's got, we're going to significantly reduce the likelihood, or we're going to get a good chunk of reduction in likelihood of crash there. We're still not addressing that severity though, but when we're looking for what are some quick cheap wins, I mean, reprogramming and some radars is a pretty low cost thing. I mean, if you're doing it on quite a few intersections, just doing one is probably going to be a pretty expensive exercise. But I think we need to continue to think and innovate around that sort of stuff. I think they call that one the new, what are they? Hold the red, I think was the term it was given this time. I can't remember what when Victoria did it. I think we called it like rogue red holder or something. Rogue was in the title. Slightly different to dwell on red, which is or rest on red, which is where you sort of have your default as red for all vehicles approaching. So pedestrians are generally protected in an area. That's more, you use that in areas around the pub and those sorts of things. What else are we seeing here coming in? Oh yeah, okay. Hillary's encouraging everybody to put it to everybody, so everybody can see, and you can have some conversations behind the scenes there. Okay, that's good. Yeah. All right. Well, let's keep moving on, and yeah, feel free to have a chat there. I'll be asking you for input shortly on different things, but I think we've set a nice platform there. I do want to talk through a couple of things, and I'll do it using a few slides that I noticed was a little bit confusing in some of your assignments, or you're a little bit confused with in some of your assignments. And that's okay, because the assignments are all about us getting our head around this exposure, likelihood, and severity. And it's going to take us a little bit of time to do that. That's okay. Okay, just recording the session. So exposure, likelihood, and severity. You've heard me say it hundreds of times already in this course, and I'll probably say it hundreds more. And what in the initial look at the assignments, and as I say, you'll get the marks on those shortly. Generally, people were really good with these two. They were quite, really good analysis and understanding of what's influencing likelihood, what's influencing severity. Exposure was a little bit hit and miss. There was some really good stuff in there on exposure, and talking about the numbers and what's driving those numbers. But then people got into a little bit of confusion about a few things that actually would sit in likelihood or severity for exposure. So let me just remind you there, in a safe system assessment, exposure is influencing the number of vehicles, the number of pedestrians, the number of cyclists or motorcyclists exposed to a crash. And really, the ultra exposure, we're sort of completely closing off something, so there is no exposure. There are no numbers of vehicles or pedestrians, like closing off that level crossing, for example. Or taking the vulnerable road users completely separated from that crash type, so then they're not exposed to that. Now, this becomes an interesting one in how far away do you have to separate a facility before it changes from a reduction in likelihood to a reduction in severity, and I've got some assistance for you in that. There is a definition, and we haven't gone into the details of the definitions in the Off-Road Safe System Assessment Framework, those sorts of things. I just wanted you to get your head around the idea. But in the definition of exposure, I think the critical part here is the measure of exposure include AADT, side road traffic volumes, number of motorcyclists, cyclists, pedestrians. So it's all going to be about the numbers. And actually, when you get to filling out a safe system assessment matrix, which take you through the details next module, it becomes fairly obvious, because it's just asking how many are there, or how many are you predicting they're going to be, and correlating that to a score. The other thing is that there are a few things within safe system assessments and within the Off-Road Safe System Assessment framework that, and the different jurisdictional guidance that's come out, that is not well defined. And so to help out in that, we've created a series of fact sheets on safe system assessment scoring, and we've put those on your memory stick into Moodle as well. And that'll be something you can refer back to as you're trying to get your head around scoring for some specific things, which we have caused people a lot of trouble, and there was a lot of variability in how people were attacking some of this scoring. So there's sheets on that one. There's the bicycle one. So at what point, the bicycle facility one, at what point does a bicycle facility change from being a reduction in the likelihood to a reduction in the exposure? So a bike lane, for example, is that going to be a change to the exposure to crashes? No, we call that a reduction in the likelihood of a bike. There's a lane there, but certainly still exposed to crashes because drivers will leave their lane for one reason or another, and and they can easily get into this bike lane. Then you put a curb between there. Are we then at the point where we could call it a reduction in exposure to crashes? Again, I'd say no. Vehicles mount the curb and can enter in that. We're starting to really pull the likelihood down now. Physical separation with a physical barrier system, then I'm happy to go into exposure reductions or significant distance offset. So that's one. Some discussions about how you'd score likelihood, how you account for volumes on the side road as well as the main road in terms of your exposure scores, how you would do an assessment of a route rather than just an intersection. And all of this stuff is there, and we'll introduce you to your assignment next module, and you'll be going out and doing some scoring and some real assessment work, and you may want to refer back to these if you get to a point of a little bit of confusion. So this module is all about pedestrians and cyclists and motorcyclists are vulnerable road users. And really, in a safe system assessment, we're going to look at their vulnerability and characteristics that increase likelihood or decrease likelihood of crashes, as well as the severity. But we're going to contextualize this in the one network framework, movement of place thinking, and I'll talk you through that at a very high level shortly. I'll explain why we want to do that within a safe system assessment. And yeah, we're gonna delve into some treatments and how they align with safe system principles. Okay, the first thing I want to do is very briefly explain this one network framework movement in place. And I suppose I'll do it using some New Zealand diagrams. And I must admit, I'm not super familiar with New Zealand's approach to this, but there is general consistency across the movement of place thinking around the world. It's called slightly different things. It's sometimes called link and place. So the one network classification sort of sitting with movement in place underpinning it. And it sort of just changes our traditional way of looking at a road network as sort of national highways, arterials, regional roads, primary collectors, and the like. It says there's a bit more to it than that. That's a very just car movement oriented way of looking at your network. And it's moved to this sort of graphs where we see that movement function is on your y-axis there, but there's a place function on the excuse me. There's a place function on the x-axis there, and New Zealand's gone, quite detailed. You've got a rural and an urban. Most jurisdictions tend to just have one that tries to cover everything, but that's a little bit more advanced. But if we zoom those up a bit, and I'll focus on the urban one at the moment, but it says that you can have areas with high place value, or you can have areas with high movement value, or they could have a mix of the two. Now, what does place value mean? Well, places are areas to interact, socialize, trade. They're vibrant areas of activity and the like. And so your real classic there is your civic spaces, which are very much not a movement corridor. They're about mingling, trading, socializing, and all of that good stuff. And they are still, though, a street or a road of some description or another. Now, I should say that when we talk about movement here, it's movement of people and goods, and it's not mode specific. It's not saying cars and trucks, but it's just saying movement of people and goods. So, you can have major movement corridors that are cycleways. So that's a major movement. You don't want people. It's not a civic space. It's not an area to trade and socialize and the like. It's about moving the people through there as fast as possible. It just happens to be the mode that they're on is bicycle. So I think that's important to note. But yeah, back down here. So we've got, high place value, low movement, civic spaces, low, sort of lower place value, still low movement. We're into, these categories of what's generally called local streets. And then you can see up there, high place value, but also high movement. And we're into, city hubs, main streets, sort of areas. Right over the other here, low place value or no place value pretty much, and high movement, your transit corridors. They are your bicycle superhighways or your freeways or the like. They're just all about movement, and we don't want people trading, socializing, interacting in those environments. So you can see there how it's broken up, and you've got this sort of activity streets one that sort of snakes its way in there. And you can see it's slightly different there for the rural environment, which I'm not going to sort of go through in detail here. But really, why would we want to or care about this in a safe system assessment is the question I think we need to understand. The reason is not about changing the score, because when you look at a road or an intersection or the like, you just score it as you see it, right? So you're going to just go volume, so to get your exposure. You're going to go likelihood factors, so you're going to look at all those things like the intersection controls, the surface, the lines, the signs, all sealed shoulders, all of that. Then you can look at the speeds and the angles and the vulnerability of road users, and you're going to get your end assessment. There it is. Right? That's how well this area aligns or doesn't align with safe system principles. So this hasn't come into it at all. But where it does come into is as soon as you move into the next phase of the assessment, which is to provide some advice, some ideas on how you can get better alignment with safe system principles. And this is where you really want to know what is the One Network movement of place categorization for this area. The reason for that is you can achieve better alignment with safe system principles in a variety of ways, but you want to do it hand in hand with the sort of strategic objectives of that area or where it's been categorized. So for example, civic space or an area has been identified as either aspiring to be a civic space or is a civic space. It's categorized as that, and you could get better alignment with safe system principles by putting barriers along the roadside and blocking off pedestrian access there. But in doing that, you will degrade the place value of it, right? So it's actually making it more of a movement corridor for vehicles by doing that. So but you could also get much better alignment with safe system principles by changing it to a shared zone, blocking off vehicle access, like car access, and doing other treatments like that, significantly slowing vehicles and the like. That is going to give you better alignment with safe system principles and also going to really help it in terms of sitting in there with the place value, and it's going to make it more friendly to trade, to interact, socialize. Likewise with your sort of urban connectors or even your transit corridors. And if you're talking about roads and vehicles and it's a sort of traffic route, certainly we can get great alignment with safe system principles by bringing speeds down to 20 kilometers an hour really slowing everything down. But again, it's not aligning with that objective of movement. So this is where we might want to do those barrier systems or those very defined crossing points and those sorts of features. We'll do a couple of little exercises on this just to get your head around it. Civic spaces, yeah, so we are seeing lots of different pop-up civic spaces and the like these days, where it's had a more of a movement function and now it's trying to bring its way back into more of a place function. So let's start with civic spaces. And I'm going to give you a little bit of time here to have a look at this artistic impression of an area. And we're going to say it is has been categorized as a civic space. And that's what they are. Any changes and things, we want to make sure that they enhance its civic spaceness. I think that's the way the term you'd use, but make it very livable, good for interaction, trade, socializing, hanging out. And we want to get it high alignment with safe system principles. So currently 40K environment, you see quite a few vehicles and pedestrians and buses and the like. So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes now to ponder that, and I'm going to let you type in your ideas, but it's not going to be as easy as that because I'm going to make sure you have to think about exposure, likelihood, and severity because I like to make you do that. So any ideas you come up with, I just want you to put them, a bracket afterwards and put exposure, likelihood, or severity, or E, L, or S. So for example, if you did say, all right, I want to do that barrier system down the side of the road here, I'm going to put barriers and it's going to reduce the severity of runoff road crashes. So barriers, S or the like. Now, as I just said to you, hopefully you wouldn't be doing that because I've just told you that we want this as civic space. We want this as easy ability to trade, to interact and the like, and that's going to sort of lean it towards more a movement corridor. So I'll give you a few minutes now, just have a jot down of a few ideas into the chat as you think of them. You can change anything you want and just put exposure, likelihood and severity after your ideas on changes. Okay, I'm seeing some wonderful ideas coming in here and really good categorization into exposure, likelihood, and severity. So well done. This group's obviously starting to really get your head around that categorization, which is going to help you out no end when you come to your next assignment, being your safe system assessment. So let's just have a look at a few of the things that came in here. And I won't get to everybody's comments, but lots of good ones and lots of reoccurring themes, which is good to see. So we've seen there reducing the number of lanes and increasing the width provided for pedestrians and cyclists. Absolutely, yep, that's going to be a really nice way to reduce the likelihood of crashes, and that was absolutely correct in terms of likelihood. And so a shorter distance to cross for pedestrians in a safe system assessment, at least, we attribute to likelihood. In the past, in the other studies and different ways of looking at things, that's sometimes been called exposure. But we do, in order to keep things clean and not double count, we just put that into likelihood in a safe system assessment. So that's a good one. Reduce street to one lane, one-way movement for motor vehicles, or remove motor vehicles entirely. Absolutely. I think that's always a great place to start when you're in that civic space area. There is minimal, if you can bring it down to no movement required, you've got almost perfect alignment with safe system principles, and you're really enhancing that civic space. So it's the first question that you should be asking in those categories. So well done, Chris. I'll give you a prize for that, for being the first to say that, and the others jumped in there very quickly afterwards as well. So then you may start to elevate and think, okay, well, we do need to have movement of some vehicles through there, and maybe you're starting with your public transport, or maybe you're providing those cycle facilities through there and going from there. And it all really depends on more of the specifics of where it sits within that movement of place categorization, and how much movement, and what are the particular users. So you haven't got enough information to do this, but what I am liking to see is the ideas are generally aligned well, and the exposure, likelihood, and severity is good. So yes, if you remove vehicles or reduce the number of vehicles there, the exposure's down. We've got lots of people talking about lowering the speed one way or another, be that lower speed limits or raised areas or the like. And absolutely, we have full license to do that within the civic space category. We're not trying to move vehicles through there fast. That's not its function at all. And we know that that's going to reduce the livability of the area and go counter to the place value that it provides. So speed significantly down if you are still providing that access through. And that's going to give us benefits in both the likelihood and the severity. Lower speeds, more time to react, evade, but also, if strikes do happen, lower severity. So some ideas on removing the parking. And so removing parking, curbside parking and the like, can reduce your likelihood in terms of opening up sight lines and being able to see better and the like. But I do always caution you that it can lead to increased speeds, depending on how it's done. So if you are going to do it, you want to, claim that space for with footpaths or curb out stands or build outs or plantings or the like, to ensure that we keep the road narrowed down, so we keep the speeds down, and we potentially open up better sight lines and the like. So installing designated pedestrian crossing points and the like. Now that's an interesting one. I would say if you're really in a civic space category and it's really entrenched in that, there's no need for those, because crossing and movement and free movement across everywhere should be absolutely, you should be able to do that everywhere, because it's all about being a place. And as soon as you start designate, oh, well, you can cross the road here and here, you've eroded it and you've altered it back to more of movement of vehicle corridor, because it's kind of saying this is a road for vehicles. Now, it gets a bit murky and blurred in there, but generally civic spaces, you wouldn't need to do that. That being said, as you elevate your movement function within a civic space, there's going to be a point where you start to, change that balance over. Yeah, so lots of good stuff in here. I'm just seeing if there's anything that's substantially different to any of the others that that came through. Lots of support for widening footpaths. Now, again, that's reducing the likelihood of crashes. Yeah, good. All right. Well done, everybody. Moving buses to parallel routes certainly could reduce the exposure to crashes. Yes, maybe even a tiny bit you could possibly attribute to severity, depending, but generally exposure. You're probably not going to get massive changes in your volume and your exposure there, because you're still going to have the passenger vehicles, but nonetheless, could be a good idea. So let's have a look at the artistic impression of this, and there's lots to like in this, but there's a couple of things I probably, anyway. But you can immediately see, without knowing anything about movement of place, if you're not a movement of place person, this looks like a nicer place to be. As a pedestrian, as a cyclist, as somebody who wants to hang out there and kids are playing and all, it's a better place, and it's going to be safer. It's going to have reduced exposure to crashes, likelihood of crashes, and severity of crashes. So we've got wins all around. The losers out of this, I suppose, if you're wanting to do that, are the passenger vehicle speed through the area. Now, that's not what anybody said its function was, so that's fine. I suppose the one thing I would say is no need to really, have designated crossing points, as I mentioned before. I don't think that's quite needed, and these whole areas should be able to cross anywhere you want, almost like a shared zone would be quite nice there, and you can see kids sort of crossing anyway here and the like. As you elevate the movement function of an area, so civic space to more movement function, but still sort of sitting squarely within that, you start to then create these designated areas for cyclists, public transport, maybe the occasional vehicle through there, but it's still very much a nice place to trade, to interact, socialize, and very low speeds, and but it's still starting to provide more and more of a movement function. Got a question here or a comment. Could the level of the road with footpath and make it visually attractive for pedestrians? Yeah, so I mean, curbs have that subtly say this is a road for cars. So you would notice shared zones and the like very much integrate your roadway with your footpath to not give that impression and that there's, that this is a road. So somebody says their screen might have frozen. Hopefully nobody else's screen's frozen. I'm going to move on to local streets. So you should be seeing a new slide on your screen. Type in if that's not the case. So local streets, so this is where it's got less place value. It's still got low movement function though. Maybe it's getting up a little bit in the movement function. I suppose when you're talking to the residents of these streets, telling them that their area has low place value is probably not a great thing to do. They don't tend to like that. But the place value that we talk about in movement and place is really, societal place value overall, with all of that extra activity and the socialization and trading and all those things. But when we're into these spaces, we can start to really prioritize vulnerable road users because we still don't have high movement requirements of passenger vehicles. Similar sort of environment, but if this one's in your local streets category, you can start to do things like sort of similar thinking, but maybe creating a bit more of a movement function there, where you're trying to provide people their access, really still make it nice, livable and safe. And we're not trying to pump any vehicles through there at high speed. It's just a nice area. Let's go to city hubs. So this is our most challenging category, really, which is where we're high place value, high movement categorization. And I will get everybody to get involved in this one, and we'll also have a little stretch break and opportunity to fill up a coffee or the like as we do this little exercise. So same sort of thing, and we're going to use this environment this time. So with that high-ish speed urban arterial, but we're going to call it a city hub. And so we've identified that it actually has high place value and high movement. And movement, remember, can be vehicles, but it can be cyclists, pedestrians, public transport, movement of people and goods. So we're sitting right, everything's important. And here we go. We've got a big, wide road, lots of lanes. There's a pedestrian overpass you can see in this artistic impression here. Pedestrian overpass. What else can you see? It's got some bits of barrier fencing and the like. So same exercise, and I'm going to give you 4 minutes, 3.5 minutes. So after I stop talking, so you can maybe run and fill your coffee up, have it as you think about it, and then come back and jot an idea or two in. But how are we going to make this better aligned with safe system principles? And we are going to make it safer. Acknowledging that it sits in that category of city hub. So high place value, high movement function. How are we going to do that? And by doing it, are we going to change exposure, likelihood, or severity, or a combination? Okay, so 3.5 minutes, have a stretch, fill up your coffee, and we'll be back into it shortly. Okay. Lots of good ideas coming in. Again, thank you. And lots of good categorization into exposure, likelihood, and severity. And I think it's all just about making sure we're providing ideas that still align with both that movement and place function that we've got in this category that we're dealing with. So this city hubs category. And it is really difficult. They're very challenging environments to deal with. And yeah, certainly where you have these multiple objectives, and these are often the roads we spend a lot of time trying to work on. But let's have a look here. So there's some discussion here around sort of starting to separate out modes: public transport, cycling, pedestrian movements, and yes, that is going to keep us our movement function going in a safer manner. And you can generally get still your higher place value if it's done and designed correctly. And it can alter either the exposure or the likelihood there in that separation, depending on how it's done. So there's some people talking about barrier systems down through the islands there. Now, again, this is that's going to improve alignment with safe system principles. It's going to probably help with the movement function as well. May slightly erode the place value, which, remember, the place value was very important there. So you have to probably be careful around that. Certainly if this was moved further into the place value requirements under movement of place were lessened, then yeah, those sorts of features are very much what you're targeting. But just be cautious of things that you might add that certainly are going to get a big tick from aligning with safe system principles, but may erode one of the strategic objectives under the movement place categorization. And that brings us on to this pedestrian overpass. And traditionally pedestrian overpasses are, well, first of all, if not designed really well and really attractive and the like, are often not utilized, and that's obviously a waste of money and the like. But they do they're not a feature that you would call enhancing place value. So the idea that pedestrians have to walk up and cross and down and stay away from this car area, that again is not really enhancing our place value. So maybe that we relook at the idea of pedestrian overpasses in those ones. And again, as I say, as you've moved the less and less place value and more concentrating on movement, that's then when these become a good feature if your movement is for, well, movement for any mode really. So some broader thinking, and I like that. Kieran's there saying park and ride facilities outside the city hub and micro mobility options, so reducing the exposure. So I do like that sort of wider, broader thinking. We're talking pretty high level conceptual stuff here, but I'm going to give a prize for a bit of out of the box thinking there. But yeah, changing the exposure. So how do we get less vehicles through there? So what else have we got here? See if I can see anything else remarkably different. No, we're getting good similarities in terms of what people are looking at. Okay, some people talking about lower speeds. That's good again. And again, like we can get good mobility through for cyclists, for public transport, and for vehicles at lower speeds than this. And it's not, 70 Ks. If it's a movement corridor, it's not like, yes, it has to be 70 kilometers an hour. No, you can get decent movement through these areas. It's put congestion pricing. So there you go, another big picture alternate way to change the exposure potentially. That's good. Oh, you're doing really well there. I'm gonna just, oh, okay, then Mike's gone big with unlimited budget, and I didn't put a budget on you, so absolutely. Cut and cover, have your traffic route underneath, and then you have your wonderful civic space on top. So yeah, absolutely, and that would be a really nice way to achieve all the objectives really beautifully. But yes, that's right, the costs there, but I didn't limit you on costs. But let's have a look at some of the artistic impressions again here, just to keep us moving along through this session. I think you're all getting the hang of this really well, and I don't need to labor on this point. But you can see here again, we've got the areas got much nicer areas for your socializing, your trade, your playing. It's providing really great movement corridors for cyclists there, you can see. Pretty good for pedestrian movement as well, with good footpaths, public transport, and it's still got the vehicle movement through there, albeit a little bit less. Now, it's hard to sort of, imagine these major transformations. I think we sort of move at it over time, but certainly you can see with that road width and that space, you can get a pretty lovely situation there. And you start to see some of that being, more and more of it starting to happen around New Zealand. We've got some, Christchurch, and you've got your separated bike facilities, which are coming up, which are all sort of, acknowledging the movement function of these roads, but also trying to continue to increase place value as you go, and trying to get those into intersections as well, and trying to cater for all road users with our protected style intersections. I can talk a little bit more about these shortly. The urban connectors. So this is where we now have said, okay, well, it's not when we're not having this strategic objective of place value in these areas. Movement is the priority. And this is where, if it's movement of vehicles particular, you can start to really make it not an area where people are going to be crossing or interacting. So you can sort of fence off or barrier off the roadsides. You can have, very specific dedicated crossing points, or this is where your overpasses or your underpasses become really attractive if you can afford them. You can do this also, as I mentioned, with sort of cycle facilities as well, big, cycle, separated cycle facilities or the like. But you are actively discouraging people from hanging out there, trading, socializing, crossing willy-nilly, and all of that. And that's accepted because it's down here. Now, what I tend to do if I'm starting out a safe system assessment is you're having conversations with the project team. What's the strategic function of the area? What are the aspirations of that? Where does it sit in the movement in place categorization? So have they done a movement in place assessment, one network assessment? And if they say, oh yeah, it's up here, it's a city hub. And I'll sort of say, oh, can we get an indication of whether it's maybe a bit more in the main streets category or a bit more in the urban factors? I'm just trying to get a little bit of something that's going to help, because these are so hard to treat with these multiple objectives. As soon as they go, no, urban factor, I go, good, okay, and we know where we're sort of heading with recommendations. Or as soon as they start to say, oh yeah, no, more main street, okay, that's good. Because I know I'm going to go much lower speeds as we enter this, and I'm going to try to provide more frequent crossing points, lower speeds, and the like. This one, I'm going to start to stop pedestrians accessing areas, and have these very specific crossing points and the like. And it's not saying one's right or wrong; it's just how you've categorized your network. even in those urban connectors, though, you do need to think about the speeds at conflict points we talked about. So, you know, if you've got your big urban collector there and there, you still want to be addressing the speed of collisions at these locations and the pedestrian crossing points. Okay, just because it's got a high, you know, it's an urban collector and it's sitting up there and we're trying to move vehicles through there as quickly as we can, for example, doesn't mean you can just ignore your safe system energy categorizations. You're just trying to achieve those objectives in slightly different ways. Okay, so let's talk about cyclists and pedestrians briefly, and then motorcyclists, and then I'm going to give you hopefully a little bit of time to do your quiz and catch up on that assignment for those that haven't quite yet got to submitting it. And you're going to want to submit that so you can get a little bit of feedback before the end of next module, which is when you are going to get your other assignment. So pedestrians and cyclists, obviously the most vulnerable to injury. Severe injury risk around the 20 kilometres per hour, 10% risk of serious injury, and death, we know, almost certain around the 50 kilometre per hour strike from the passenger vehicle. And you can remember back to our module 1 coloured grading of severity, and you'll be using that sort of stuff, and pedestrians and cyclists are in there. The young and old, even more vulnerable, of course, and we want to ideally manage speeds around that 20 kilometres per hour at those conflict points, or seek to separate. Don't forget to count your Wallies. I'm sure Wally would appear this session, or maybe already appeared. So yeah, the separation of vulnerable road users through a lot of the corridors is obviously becoming a more attractive thing to do, getting better at it. We're understanding different ways to do it, utilising parking, for example. Now, would I call this an alteration in exposure or likelihood or severity? Hard one here. It will really depend on how the access to driveways and side roads all happens. But maybe for this segment, I'm happy to say it's an alteration in exposure to crashes because I got the parking and the different facilities. And then when we have things like an urban roundabout, for example, which we know do a good job for passenger vehicles in reducing speeds, and so reduce the severity of crashes, it's becoming more and more commonplace to look at facilities for cyclists and pedestrians around that. So not necessarily ripping it out, but still trying to provide that speed advantage. Also, it continues a sort of movement flow, which was the original reason for roundabouts, but we're now latching onto their safety benefit. But here you see the sort of, this is a concept of Moray Street in Victoria, which is built now, but providing facilities to make it clear who's got priority, raised to slow down, dedicated cycle facilities around. And what we see there is a reduction in the likelihood of crashes and the severity of crashes for all road users. And, you know, that theory could apply there at something like a larger multi-lane roundabout where you still got your cycling routes going through. If you know, ideally would grade separate and have your cycle routes, or you'd have ideally you'd have your vehicles have to go up an incline or down and your cyclists stay at a nice flat grade through. But you know, you can have cyclist facilities that come off and have priority through and continue on, where then you've reduced the likelihood of crashes, but you've also reduced the severity of crashes with raised points. So if anything does happen there, and then maybe you've got your ability for cyclists to wait and then stage their crossing and continue on if they're doing a right turn, which probably more reducing the likelihood because the severity of the crash there is going to still be there. Now, these are your sort of tangential style roundabouts, which are encouraging a degree of speed. They certainly slow vehicles down on the approach and they're chicaning in, but they're trying to maintain a level of speed. And you can, talk about radial roundabouts, which sort of lower speeds even further. But we don't need to go into that detail. I think you've got the ideas there. A little diagram here, adapted off a Dutch diagram originally, but sort of ability to share the road space at low speeds. But then you're going to want physical separation as speed goes up, be that through the parking facilities, utilizing that, or curbing or the like. And then up at your very high speeds, completely separated, alter the exposure to crashes, eliminate that exposure to crashes. So just spot prize. Somebody can tell me what the name of that symbol is? Kieran's got there again. Nia's in there as well, very close second, so 2 prizes there. And I'm just reading another question here. Any literature on vulnerable elderly and their inability to recover from high trauma crashes? Not in terms of the injury severity and those sorts of ones that I know off the top of my head, but there's a couple of really interesting, there's a really good Austroads report that was done about infrastructure and elderly and which particular infrastructure characteristics make it harder for elderly to use and more likely to be killed or seriously injured. So more likelihood, more severity. So it was analysing, cognitive processing ability, ability to move, to turn head, to make complex decisions, the way they walk and slower movements and those sorts of things, and sort of categorising that. So that was an Austroads report that Bruce Corbin led. That's a really good report from that perspective. But in terms of injury, length of injury, recoverability, and those sorts of things, I don't know anything off the top of my head, sorry. Sharrow was the answer, in case it was put out there to everybody as well. So lots of people jumping in on that. Yeah. Okay, let's keep moving on. Let's talk briefly about pedestrians, then I'll get into motorcyclists. And as I say, give you a little bit of time to do your assignments, or we can have a bit of a chat. So here's a New Zealand crossing, and I understand you're not using red anymore on your pedestrian crossings for visual contrast for vision impaired, I think was the reasoning. But anyway, nonetheless, let's talk about raising pedestrian crossings, or we call them a wombat crossing in Australia. But I don't think it's called a wombat crossing in New Zealand. It's just called a raised pedestrian crossing. But to me, this is a wonderful, highly aligned, safe system feature. And as you can see there, reduces both the likelihood and the severity of crashes. Now, if this is just a normal at-grade pedestrian crossing, a zebra crossing, we're actually probably not going to give it any improvement in likelihood or severity of crashes. Now, you might find that a bit strange, but the thing is that there's some good evidence out there that shows that we have increased crashes in some locations with the installation of a zebra crossing. Severity is just as high because there's nothing to lower speeds, but somehow magically where we elevate it, we get this reduction in both likelihood and severity. And people are more visible, you can see them easier. The vehicles slow down on the approach, obviously, in order to navigate that well. And so my sort of rule of thumb is is that if you have the pedestrian desire line and the either latent demand or current demand for a pedestrian crossing, you've got enough to raise it. Like there's no, I can't come up with a scenario as to why you would raise it. I shouldn't say. The reasons I would say you don't need to raise it is if you've already got incredibly low speeds in the area due to a whole lot of other features down, in the area, and it's already very low speeds. If you're getting absolute, huge pushback from buses or freight or something like that, and then, no, we can't have anything raised. I mean, I disagree with that. You can absolutely do it, and there's plenty of these where buses are, fine and the like. But maybe you might look at some cushions that they can navigate and slowing them on the approach. So questions come in about if you provide pedestrian or cyclist facilities which unlocks latent demand, are we increasing exposure? And that's a good question. That is a really good question. It plays out a little bit in a safe system assessment where you might alter your exposure scores. And what we would do that. We would account for that in a safe system assessment. And it just shows you, though, that if you're going to put a pedestrian facility in and you're going to encourage more than crossing at that location, well, you've got to make sure your likelihood and your severity are right down. And so if you do it like this, you're going to get a win all round. And yes, you might have a little bit of an increase in exposure, but very low likelihood and very low severity of crashes. And this little example, this is quite old. This is sort of 15 years ago, but in Adelaide, and this to me is a great example of how we've known how to create safe system environments for vulnerable road users for a very long time. But what it is there was a couple of workers doing work in the on the electrics and all of the signals in the little island thingy in there. They were in there for a couple of weeks, different bits and pieces and accessing stuff. And anyway, for them to do their work safely, the speed limit was reduced to 25 kilometres per hour because that's South Australia's work zone speed limit. I think they're one of the only ones that I know of, and they're 25 for that. But anyway, so there you go. And barriers put up. So it's usually a 60 kilometre per hour speed zone, or it was back in the day. It's not anymore. But so they go and they do their work for a couple of weeks, and then they leave and they pack up and they get rid of the barriers. And they put the speed limit back up to 60. And then there's like 3,000 pedestrians a day that stand in this area waiting to cross the road and crossing the road. And so for some reason, the workers, it's deemed unacceptable for them to be exposed to that risk, but the travelling public, yeah, they can be exposed to that. People make an argument, oh well, the workers are looking at their work, they're not concentrating on the traffic, so they're at more risk. Well, I mean, we know pretty well that pedestrians, a good portion of them are looking at their phone or intoxicated or making judgment calls and these sorts of things. So I think we really do know how to create these environments, but we just don't tend to afford that thinking to the general public a lot of the time. We push safety back to them and fully to their responsibility. And if I ever have to do that elevator pitch of safe system or something, so what's this safe system? I do often just say, well, you're familiar with workplace health and safety and the way you look after workers near a road or the like? Yeah, and they say yes. And say, yeah, well, just afford that same level of safety to the full travelling public, which they can sort of understand a little bit. But we do see some great features out there and some much better alignment. And we're really, it's pretty exciting. And it's also going hand in hand with the increased livability, active transport mode. And we should, from a safe system perspective, just ride those coattails, because it's win-win. We're going to get healthier, more livable areas which have better alignment with safe system principles. So raising intersections like this going to give us lots of great outcomes. Threshold treatments, so as vehicles turn into areas, having areas that slow them, good crossing points for pedestrians. And speeds down, bringing speeds down in these areas where we've attributed high place value, not a major movement corridor at all under any circumstances. And this is sort of the graph of the year that they changed the default from 60 to 50. So you can see just a default speed limit change has some pretty massive impacts on your crashes. Okay. Motorcyclists. I'll briefly talk about this other vulnerable road user type. And some of you, I think, have certainly been touring around New Zealand many times talking about motorcycle infrastructure safety, but 5 S's I like to talk about: sight, surface, signs, strike, and speed. So if we look at that, the ability for a motorcyclist to see what's coming up and for other vehicles to see a motorcyclist, the surface that they're riding on and the signs are all likelihood factors. So warning signs and regulatory signs and the like. The strike, we're talking about when a motorcyclist is crashing, what are they hitting, what are they striking? That's a severity factor. And speed is both likelihood and severity. And there's been some recent research that's emerged. A colleague of mine in Sweden was working on this for quite a while, of motorcycle injury risk curves. And so I'll pop them into your notes so you can refer to if you want. And we usually attributed motorcycle or categorized motorcycles with pedestrians and cyclists for lack of any better knowledge. We see from this a shift slightly up in terms of their energy absorption, their ability to withstand crashes at different speeds, but nowhere near what a car passenger can take. Right? Even with the helmet and the body armor and the like, we're still not seeing them able to withstand anywhere near the forces of a passenger vehicle crash, of course. They're pretty much an unprotected road user. But let's have a look at a few quick things. So obviously motorcyclists are smaller, easily hidden there behind trees, power poles, shrubs, signal controller boxes, things that we generally wouldn't consider as major sightline impediments. So these sorts of things are increasing the likelihood of crashes for motorcyclists. And when you do a safe system assessment, you're asked specifically to tell us features that increase or decrease the likelihood of motorcycle crashes. And so you can have a think about some of those sort of things. The surface is a big one for motorcyclists. We know a motorcyclist leans as going around the curve, and 2 small contact patches on the road surface. So surface issues become a big thing for motorcyclists far more than any other road user. In fact, we call them the canary in the coal mine when it comes to surface issues. The first ones to be killed or seriously injured as the surface degrades. And we need to think about all those different things that we might be putting out there on the road network. Steel plates, your classic example, obviously, if it's a bit wet, a little bit of moisture on that, maybe in the dark, and maybe that motorcyclist is following behind another vehicle, we immediately know that they're at a far higher likelihood of crashing. Signs. So motorcyclists are highly aware of signage, and we can, yes, sorry, the steel plate's bad for cyclists as well. Yeah, the motorcyclists really aware, and we can get good likelihood reduction for motorcyclists using signage. There are specific signs that you can use to highlight issues for motorcyclists, and as I understand, these are used in New Zealand now. So if you've got a particular concern for motorcycles, maybe a surface issue or the like that you want to warn, you can talk to motorcyclists directly using this sign and any supplementary plates you like, and proven to be quite effective. But general signage, good general signage, clear, consistent signage is going to improve the likelihood of, so reduce the likelihood of motorcycle crashes. It's going to reduce the likelihood of all crashes, but motorcyclists seem to get a little bit more benefit out of this as well. If we jump to strike now, the motorcyclists are, as I mentioned, more vulnerable, and I'll show you the European crash barrier test for motorcycle underrun. But this is a test that's done at 60 kilometers an hour, 25-degree angle. You basically slide your motorcycle dummy, and a motorcycle crash test dummy is a normal crash test dummy with a few little alterations, and then put into riding gear. And then you slide it along. And so the first crash you do is into the post of the barrier, and then you do it in between posts. And so you can see the 60 km/h crash there. That other one was at the post. And then this one has an underrun protection device there. And you can see there that the first one, you can see there's a bit of cushioning as well in the underrun protection. I'll play that again. I'll play that again because 60 km/h direct impact into a post. And you can see there it writes off the dummy. That's like a $360,000 dummy that was written off in that thing. And the forces are just, you can't handle that. But the underrun protection, where you're redirecting energy along, absorbing a bit of energy, but pushing the energy along, is where you get this wonderful reduction in the severity of crashes. So question, is that video available? I think it's in your on your memory stick and in Moodle, and if it's not, I'm just writing myself a note, I will put it there. But the resources from each module usually have any videos that are played in there. So, and hearing that a motorcyclist was killed last night in Brazil. Yeah, that's at a very high speed. So yeah, they're certainly speeds completely that motorcyclists will not be able to handle. And talking about speeds, the ability to influence speed reduces the likelihood and severity of crashes within limitations. If we are sort of talking 110 kilometers an hour and we can get speeds down to 100 kilometers an hour, the severity is still going to be 4 for motorcycles. 4 is our highest. Like, the severity is still very high. But we reduce the likelihood of crashes a bit, balancing speed out. But if we can have clear, consistent speed advice, regulatory speed limits appropriately, and utilize local area traffic management features and the like in appropriate locations, we can reduce the likelihood and severity of crashes. Now, the question that often comes up, and I'll just utilize this as a little whiteboard, is what about wire rope safety barrier? So I showed you this one with the underrun protection for a flexible W beam. Well, a wire rope safety barrier has some challenges for motorcyclists, but the motorcycle sort of community has some, put this out there as the most dangerous thing ever for motorcyclists, the cheese cutter, they call it. Now, I'm a licensed motorcycle rider, but I got my license in order to understand a bit more about riding and help out with different things. But let me give you some info about wire rope safety barriers and motorcyclists. And I think it looks like there's a link there from a Wakakatahi NZTA one as well, which I assume will be from the same info. But there's been a lot of research into crashes with barriers and motorcyclists. And what it's shown is that there's a very tiny percentage of those crashes that are motorcyclists hitting wire rope safety barriers. And that's for a couple of reasons. One being that we don't tend to use wire rope safety barrier on popular motorcycle touring routes because we can't. Because often they are routes that have this, windiness to them, which is very attractive on a motorcycle touring route, your Coromandel loop and those sort of areas. And for anybody who knows a little bit about barrier systems, if you've got a curve like that and you put a wire rope safety barrier on it, and, so we're looking down on the curve, obviously here. So if this is a wire rope safety barrier, you put it in and then you tension it up, because you put your wires in and then you tension it. What's it going to do? It's going to pop into the middle of the road. And you'll even notice that as you put a wire rope safety barrier. If you ever put a wire rope safety barrier on minimum radius curve, like the absolute minimum you can really do it is 200 radius curve. And then you start to tension it up, or you stand there and watch as they're tensioning it up. You watch the posts start to want to go into the middle. They start to move. They really want to go, right? So we just don't use that in these areas. We use wire rope safety barrier on your long, straightish roads, predominantly as a fatigue management trick. People fall asleep, they leave the road, and then they get out of control, and then the barrier's there. We don't see motorcyclists falling asleep in the same manners and drifting off the road. They're subject to a lot of very different crash types. And so really the areas we use wire rope safety barriers are not high risk motorcycle areas at all. So that's one. And then the other one is that half the motorcyclists hitting barrier systems are off the bike sliding, and they hit the bottom, they hit the posts, right? The wires are not playing. The other half hit the barrier and go over the top. The motorcyclist leaves the bike won't run along the barrier. They go over the top. That's based off a heap of research out of University of New South Wales to show all of that. So the wires themselves are just not playing a role. Where there is some degree of, you can say, okay, that there's something we've got to work on here, which is that we don't have anything great for the posts. There is no underrun longitudinal system for a wire rope safety barrier, as in something that the motorcyclist can run along. The best that anybody seems to have come up with is a post padding product, like a stack cushion around each post, kind of like your football goalpost padding. And that's like acknowledged not to be as good as redirecting the energy along something to run it out over time. But the reality is, it's the anybody who jumps up and down about this as an issue as a motorcycle is barking up the wrong tree. There's far greater things that are far bigger risks to motorcyclists, but there's a little bit of something in there. Yeah, all right. I'm happy to take any questions or comments people have around either motorcyclists. So a good question there's coming to the Q&A. How about the signpost strike, wooden post or frangible post? So absolutely, agree that we do need to be very careful about putting posts, sign poles, galvanized steel posts, wooden posts into the roadside, particularly on the outside of curves, because they are a hazard for motorcyclists. So yeah, you need to be careful there. There are some products out there that are more friendly for motorcyclists. We're working at the moment on another one with a few different universities, something that's a bit more withstands the wind and the weather and everything a bit better than some of the plasticky products that are out there, and you know, fires and the mower and those sorts of things, which has been very annoying with some of the other flexible, frangible products, but certainly something to be aware of and to think about. So what we deem frangible for passenger vehicles is certainly not frangible for a motorcyclist sliding along and striking that. Any other questions or comments? Well, thank you very much. I mean, that's been a good session. You've provided a lot of input. I think a lot of stuff you were kind of aware of, a lot of you will be aware of in different ways, and it's about contextualizing it into how we utilize that in the Safe System Assessment Framework. And that's what next session is all about, is how do you actually fill out the framework? Because now you're all on board with the principles. Now you're getting really good at categorizing exposure, likelihood, and severity. And next module is to say, right, well, let's take all of that knowledge and ideas and then just put it into this consistent form for assessing and scoring an area with its alignment with safe system principles. And then we'll send you out to do a safe system assessment in your local area, mock safe system assessment. But anybody who hasn't yet managed to get to their assignment, please do that. As I say, great way to get some feedback before you do the big assignment, to make sure you get your head around things nicely. You can have multiple goes at it, of course, so just get something down on paper if you're a bit confused, or give me a call or shoot me an email. We can organize a one-on-one catch-up. And you've got a quiz at the end of this one. Jump into that, do the quiz, and we'll see you all in a couple of days' time to take you through the module 4, ready to get you out there. So the question is, do I provide feedback for module 2 assignment? Yes, you will get a mark and you'll get feedback. Anything that you didn't quite get right, you'll get that feedback. And that's what I'm saying, before you get into your main assignment, you want to get that feedback so you don't make the same mistakes in the next one. And so, yeah, you'll get that in the next couple of days. All right, thanks everybody. You have a wonderful day. Jump in, do that quiz, finish that assignment, last assignment off, and see you in a couple of days' time. Bye.